Okay, we're going live.
Hey, Grisha.
Hello, hi Grisha. Um, Good afternoon. My name is Terry Wilhelm. I'm part of the board of directors for Equality New York, and I'm chairperson of the Transgender, Non-Binary, and Non-Conforming Policy Committee. Tonight we're holding a very special panel tonight on um, a transgender and non-binary anti-discrimination requirement in school. The bill's number is A840 and it's sponsored by Assembly Member Godfrey. And on the Senate side, it's S390, 369, Hoyleman. And let's see, this is some of the parts of our conversation tonight are gonna have a little bit of make people feel a little insecure and may think they want to reach out to talk to somebody in case it's disturbing to them. So we're going to run a crisis warning throughout the event in the chat box. If you want to have numbers to call and whoever to speak to, and there's some warm and cold lines and some emergency information in there if you need it. I would like to introduce our moderator this evening, my good friend Owen Gilbo, who was on the Jenny, on the GENNY, right? Gender Expansive New York on the board of directors, and is a very classy person, and I'm very happy to meet him. And take it away, Owen.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Transgender and Non-Binary Anti-Discrimination Schools panel discussion. We have a very distinguished panelist, a set of panelists here tonight. As Terry said, my name's Owen Gilbo. I work for the New York State Department of Civil Service as a diversity and inclusion specialist. Though I'm not here on official duties tonight, I'm here as a advocate for the gender variant citizens of New York and gender variant citizens throughout the world. And I'm honored to have been asked to be to moderate this evening's discussion. I was 45 years old when I first heard the term transgender, and all of a sudden, I had an explanation for who I was. There is a name for someone like me. I struggled for years to try to figure out who I was, what was wrong with me, because society didn't seem to have a place for someone like me. It was my therapist that introduced the word to me. And I learned that I was not alone. There are others. In fact, gender variant people have been around for a long, long time. And more are feeling empowered to come out and live authentically. Now, the journey is not easy. It's not the same for everyone. And some face great discrimination, and some, while others may not. I heard Laverne Cox speak once at a community college. It was on my birthday. That's what I wanted for my birthday, was to hear Laverne Cox, the actress, speak. And she shared that in her struggle, she tried to figure out what was wrong with her because society tells us that we are wrong. Not that we're doing something wrong, but that we are wrong, but that our very being is wrong. I had never identified with someone before the way I identified with Laverne at that moment. Personally, I am out so that people know that I and my gender variant siblings are here. There is nothing wrong with us, and we have the right to live as others do. And that right to live as others do, to be protected, supported, and empowered, includes our schools. And once I came to realize who I was excited, or to who I am. I was excited to think of all the things I could become and do as a man. But I had to remind myself that I was 47, not 7 or 17 or even 27. And I see gender variant children and teens in school today, and I marvel at their strength as they try to navigate the world authentically. I wanted to go back to my school days and play baseball and hockey. not softball. I wanted to go back and live as the boy I knew myself to be, but that's not how it works. So, what I can do is advocate for today's youth, and you'll meet some of our youth tonight. I can fight to have legislation like the transgender and non-binary interdiscrimination requirements in schools bill passed into law. It's something we can all do. Tonight's event is being sponsored by the Equality New York Committees, the TGNCNB Committee, the Youth, Families, and Aging Committee, and the Body Autonomy Committee. And Equality New York believes that transgender, gender non-conforming, and non-binary New Yorkers must be centered in all policy and system changes, given historically that TGNCNB people have been left behind when prioritizing the LGBTQIA plus agenda. This panel discussion will focus on the pending New York State legislation. That's the Transgender and Non-Binary Anti-Discrimination Act requirements in schools. That's the Senate Bill 369, Assembly Bill 840, and why the passage of this measure is crucial to the health, dignity, and identity of TGNCNB youth, and how New Yorkers can be part of making certain this bill comes into law. And so I'd like each of our panelists tonight to introduce themselves. And I will tell you that we have a special panelist tonight who's celebrating a birthday, a really important birthday. I'm going to let he and his mom go first in their introduction. And then in a little bit, when we talk about some questions, I'm going to let this young man tell you a little bit of his story. And then we're going to be really kind and we're going to let him go celebrate his birthday, right? So happy 9th birthday to Seth Jones. And Seth, please introduce yourself, and your mom can introduce herself as well. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, my name's Seth Jones, and my pronouns are he, him, his, and boy. And I'm a trans boy.
And I'm Lindsay Jones. I use she, they pronouns. I'm on the advisory council at Equality New York. I'm Steph's mom. I'm a parent advocate, and I'm also part of the Gender Family Project at Ackerman Institute with Seth. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good evening. My name is Alex Kuridi, and I'm a program director for our crisis intervention and substance abuse programming at Cat and Lord. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. How about Gricia? Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Gracia Magdaleno. I use they, them pronouns, and I currently serve as the Policy and Advocacy Manager for an organization outside of New York known as Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, which is focused on providing support and creating safer spaces for LGBTQ youth in K through 12 schools. And I am happy to provide an out-of-state perspective.
Thank you, Gracia. And next, Mix Cleo, there you are. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello everyone. Good evening. Again, happy birthday to Seth and their family. I am Mix Daniels. My pronouns are listed: she, they, angel, anything expensive goes. I was born and bred in New York City, and I went through this school system, so I have that experience. And unfortunately, there were so many resources and knowledge and even support that I wasn't provided to transitioning into a role working in over 10 years in youth development, as well as a teaching artist with the city schools, and and as well as local nonprofits, and also having a private practice supporting survivors to reclaim their narratives through an art therapeutic lens. And I'm so happy to be here, and I really would love to shed light on perspectives that are not heard and why this bill is more relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Micah, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Micah. My pronouns are she, her. I am at McAllen College in the Twin Cities. I am taking my first virtual class right now. It's very exciting. It's about biological anthropology. I really like science, and I am very enthusiastic about this issue.
Great, thank you. And Rashad, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Owen. My name is Rashad Brown, and I am a teacher and member of UFT. I serve as the chairperson of our Pride Committee, which is our LGBTQ committee, where we give a platform to our members to educate and learn more about the LGBTQ community, as well as for our students to educate them as well, and to give them a platform to have exposure to other students like themselves. And we also give out a scholarship every year to high school graduating seniors who are LGBTQ activists. And I work with the NYSA, which is our New York State union, and their LGBTQ community committee as well.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much. So the transgender and non-binary anti-discrimination requirements in schools, this measure will actually add a new subdivision to what is called DASA, Dignity for All Students Act. So DASA is currently in place, but this will add a new subdivision to that act. And so officially, it's going to add subdivision 6 to Article 2, Section 13 of New York State Education Law. That's the Dignity for All Students Act. And it's a measure which seeks to provide the state's public and elementary elementary and secondary school students with a safe and supportive environment. There are 4 components to this subdivision. This law would require the Board of Education of all school districts in New York State, I believe that's about 1,000 school districts, to establish policies and procedures regarding the treatment of transgender students. And transgender here is used as an umbrella term to include all gender variant students. It will also codify into New York State education law that pronouns must be used that are consistent with a student's gender identity. It will codify into New York education law that student sports, course of study, and facilities be offered in a way that is consistent with a student's gender identity. And it will make unlawful for New York schools to ask for or require medical documentation, diagnoses, treatment, or identification as a prerequisite to acknowledging a student's gender expression. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about why this is so important. And why it's important is because this bill, if passed into legislation, and we're fighting to get this passed. So let's be honest about that. This is what we're asking you to do tonight, is to make sure you contact your legislators and tell them how important this bill is to the students of New York State. And I can't stress that enough, right? It's so important. It's our youth's lives that we're talking about. And as I said earlier, everyone deserves to be protective and to have a safe, supportive environment. That's how we all grow. So this codifies it into law, and it makes it a requirement. It gives it a little more teeth. It's not just a suggestion. It's the way that it needs to be. And that's why this is so important. Now, we're going to look at a few questions tonight, and I'll ask our different panelists to give us their views and their thoughts. We'll go back and forth a little bit, and the panelists know a little bit what I'm going to ask, but perhaps not completely. And if I call on someone, but somebody else wants to chime in, please just raise your hand so I can see that. But also, those of you in the audience, please go ahead and submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll have a question and answer period a little later. So as I promised, we're going to give Seth first shot at this, right? Because what everyone needs to do on their birthday is to be supported in the way that they get to celebrate. And so we want Seth to be able to do that. So Seth, I'd like, if you would, to lead us off. Why does New York need this bill? Why do we need to pass this? How will this bill make a difference, do you think, in your life at school, both elementary school and when you get to middle school and high school? Why is this so important?
I think it's so important because like there are lots of like LGBTQ like community kids that aren't getting treated enough for like themselves.
Do you want to tell me what happened to you at school?
Yeah. Kind of like me at my old school. So I used to go to PS 71 and I had a art teacher and we were made to do a hand print kind of and like draw in the inside of the outline. And I kind of drew this. So I drew this for like trans. And then when it was time to show it off to everyone, I showed it off and told them what it was about. And I was just telling them who I was and how this makes a connection. And then my art teacher came to me and said, "You can't show this. You can't show your expression or feelings. Now go to the back of the class." And I was just like so devastated. And it's just like the point of art is to express your feelings. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. And it's just like probably lots of kids would have a bad experience if we didn't try and get this bill. So we gotta try and persevere to get the bill done, so then lots of other kids can be supported more.
Thank you, Seth. I got to tell you, Seth, that you're pretty amazing. I love your vocabulary. And I was a school teacher. I taught 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So I wish you would have been one of my students, right? You really would have rocked. You must rock the classroom. And thank you for speaking out, because I think that's important. You're not just speaking out for you, right? You're speaking out for all the other kids as well. So I'm going to look forward, Seth, to the ways in which you lead us, the leadership you provide in the world as you grow older. So thank you very much for sharing your story. And now I think all of us would like you to go and celebrate all that being 9 this day means to you. All right. Happy birthday.
Bye.
Bye. So Lindsay, would you like to talk a little bit about what the bill means to you?
Sure. I'd love to talk about it. I'll just go back to that experience Steph was sharing with you at our old school. Is that I know that, I was called into parent-teacher conference. So Steph hadn't told me that right away. They had separated Seth from the rest of the class and put Seth at the back of the class, last row with no other kids, and they were on working in groups otherwise. And so it wasn't until a parent-teacher conference that I heard about it about a month and a half later. So they kept Seth isolated and separated just for expressing who he is. And when the teacher was telling me at parent-teacher conference, I was just trying to make sense of what she was telling me, but she had told me that they were afraid of what the other parents would think. And so, you know, my thoughts on that just briefly is just, you know, that it's the teacher's job to educate and protect the children. And I know there's a lot about adults out there that still need a lot of education that wasn't provided, you know, even when I was growing up. But I think, you know, it's going to reduce like bullying and suicide and violence, but I'll skip over that. So not to skip over it, that's major. But after that, I called the principal, that didn't work, the vice principal. So I ended up going to city council and I spoke to Danny Drum, who put me in touch with Jared Fox, who at the time was the liaison, LGBTQI liaison for the Department of Education. And Jared helped me for a year emailing the school, and I still wasn't getting, there was no bathroom, the pronouns were not being used correctly, even though there were guidelines in place. They were at the Department of Education in New York City, they weren't being followed. So it wasn't until I ran into Jared Fox at a gender conference that he decided to go into the school the next day because we saw each other in real life. And he went into the school and implemented like all in 1 hour. He didn't really give them a choice, but Jared was in charge of so many schools. So of course he couldn't do that for every school. But you know, what I've learned from that is that even if there are certain, the Department of Education has some guidelines in New York City that they're not being followed or implemented. And then they did implement, they got the new bathroom, they were trained to use pronouns and not do the boy-girl lineups anymore, which they were doing. But so that was great. They implemented into the school, but I ended up leaving the school anyway, and we have a new school and it's so much better. And it's proof that it can be done. They were already, you know, on board with pronouns, and they have a bathroom, and, you know, I signed all my gender papers, and it's been completely different experience. Stuff is so much happier, confident, is on the principal honor roll, is in Taekwondo, is a high purple belt in Taekwondo, and just is like doing so well and loves school. So it was like black and white difference of how that affects Seth and his mental health and just his happiness. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Micah, would you like to add anything in terms of what you think the impact of students would be, the K through 12 students?
Yeah, no problem. So this is a gap year. So my most recent year in high school was my junior year of high school, actually, because I took, for my senior year, I was on exchange abroad. But I think that from what I've seen in New York schools, there are definitely things like the boy-girl lineups that still exist that are very anachronistic. There's definitely bullying. Personally, in my personal experience, I have found that it is a lot worse at the elementary school level rather than the middle and high school level. I think that probably has to do with, you know, students becoming more educated versus just reflecting what their parents say. But I also think that part of the issue is that elementary schools don't encounter this issue as much, and they aren't really being given proper trainings in relation to how do we deal with this. And I think that's a really big issue. And I think that it probably mostly affects elementary school students if the teachers and administrators there aren't getting the right training right now.
Excellent, thank you. That's a really good point in terms of the age class, and we'll talk a little bit too about the topic a little bit further down about, how for some reason adults feel very uncomfortable talking about LGBTQI community with young children, but we are okay with talking about cisgender, heterosexual discussions with young children. But somehow when we're talking about gender variant, non-heterosexual, then all of a sudden it's sort of R-rated or something like that, and it's difficult to talk about. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll reflect on it a little bit more. McStanos, would you like to just say a little bit about how you think this might impact our K through 12 students?
Yes, thank you so much. I first want to say as a former student who, as much as I went to some private religious schools, but we also have to consider being that they're funded by the state and city, they are not following the requirements to keeping our students safe. And I can't even tell you about the experiences of depression and lack of hope, and added having nowhere to turn to when, even though I'm just a 90s baby, I didn't know at the time that I was supposed to be protected under New York City law. I was supposed to be given resources instead of being shamed by teachers and being told what I am or what I'm not, or where I can or where I can't be. I just wanted to read just a few points, something that we were talking about. I think folks need to remember that early childhood is when scientists say that folks really start to begin to notice their gender as it forms. And then later on, we see that sexuality develops in other forms of expression identity. So it goes back to what Micah said about schools are not only education centers, they're also community centers, and they need to uplift and protect a child. We have children in our school that are coming from malnourished homes, from unstable homes, homelessness, and added, there's a lot of folks that come to New York from other states because whether it's a GED or whether it's certain protections, so it doesn't even include all the numbers of all the kids that are registered in our schools. But if our schools are not a safe space, and if teachers are not informed to be protective and affirming, how can we expect the most of our children? And I'll just say like this, I remember working in a bunch of public schools in the Bronx, and I was sitting by accident in a teachers meeting, and I was shocked that I saw the New York City Council of Education, Department of Education, teaching not only non-transgender staff members, but saying that kids that you don't understand their pronouns, you call them it, or mocking and telling the parents about the kid's identity and how they express themselves. It was this was only a few years ago, and this show you not only the blatant bigotry, the discrimination, the lack of knowledge. And I was the only one out of those teachers that spoke up and said something, because most of the teachers who were there for a long time looked at me and said, why do we need to hear this? Why is this important? Even though I wasn't saying this. So again, we need to have resources that prevents bullying, that prevents misgendering. Schools are seen as a second home. Teachers not respecting those identities and making sure that they feel safe, because not every kid comes to school, even in a liberal environment, and has a liberal welcoming family. And the school needs to step in if they see that there's some sort of neglect and punishment, to ensure that all kids who know who they are protected and supported and reminded that you are loved. And that helps our kids flourish. And most importantly, what this bill will start to do will not only create a statewide conversation about trans inclusion, and again, there's thousands of trans folks that come to New York, whether as dreamers or from other states, because of New York's protection, and we need to provide a welcoming environment for everyone. But we do not have in New York State liaisons that are trans competent or trans themselves. We don't even have trans representatives in city council and in the state, and we call ourselves a progressive state, and this is very much troublesome, and it trickles down to harm. And again, with that being said, we need to de-stigmatize our schools.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. And I'd like to just come back in the third part of this. We're going to talk about what we can do. And those last comments you just made, I think, are important about what our next steps and what we can do. So thank you. And everything you said is really so important. We are to provide the protections and the safe spaces, and our kids don't always have that, and we can't lie to ourselves and say, well, they're supported at home, because we know that isn't the case. So thank you for bringing those. So all of you who talked about why this is needed, and I'd like to just hear from a couple of people about some of the contributing factors that really bring rise to that. And we talked, you can hear it from everything we've heard so far, but I'd like to talk, and a couple of people, Lindsay, both you and McDaniels brought it up, this idea or the concern for mental health for our youth. And if Alex, would you like to talk a little bit about the contributing factors that make this bill so important as it relates to that?
Yes, I think everybody so far has brought up so many important points on why it's important to provide visibility and protection to our youth, right? And I think sometimes what we hear is that these demands are kind of frivolous, right? Like that we are kind of giving in to these youth by doing what they ask or what they need. I've heard plenty of people in this work saying, oh, I went through bullying, I survived bullying, like why does this become my problem? And at the end of the day, it is all of our problem, because our youth deserve to feel safe going to school. You should be able to go to school and learn, not have to, watch your back for how people treat you, or worry about being harassed, even sexually assaulted or killed. And worst of all, that you are in a world that is so unforgiving, so unloving, that you want to kill yourself. So I think, for me, this bill is so important because it provides protection and safety from suicide. It allows for youth to go to school and just do that, go to school and learn. And it makes us accountable as the adults and as the systems that create our culture to provide that support and safety. Because kids should not have to think about that. And they should never have to worry about whether they deserve to be alive or not because of who they are. So to me, that's why this bill is so important. It's a matter of protection from death.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, so important. And, I know speaking, I told you that, my struggle was long. I was 45 before I heard some word. I had some explanation of who I was. And boy, it was so accurate too. I mean, I thought about when I wrote that, like all of a sudden, it sounds a little too fairy tale-ish, but my gosh, it really was, because I was trying to connect, and I even used that, it's like I got this life, but this is my real life. And, in doing that, it's like, how do I get this to be this? And I heard the word, and mental health struggle, I'm not, I'll share with people that I did struggle. I struggled because when society is telling you you can't do this, or you're not woman enough, or, even to the point where, why do you wear hats? That makes you look like a guy. And, inside I'm going, great, because that's exactly who I am. But then I have to not wear my hats, or, I was talking earlier, I had to wear makeup and pantyhose, all these things that just was not me. Give me a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, a baseball glove, and a hat, and I would have been perfectly happy. But I had to really work hard to be something that I wasn't. And that takes a toll on people. And it could take us to dark places. But statistics show that with just even one supportive adult, the percentage of suicide drops, just one. So imagine when you go to school and there's all of this support, or community support. So important. So thank you for that. And Grecia, would you like to say something as well?
Yeah, definitely. So contributing factors, one thing that comes to mind is also the idea that homes are not necessarily supportive for trans and gender expansive students, and so youth. And so we have to think about what is the environment in which children are coming to school that makes it important for us to be able to pass this sort of bill. And I know that I'm working for an out-of-state organization, but I'm Brooklyn-based, and what I've noticed in schools is that it's about not just supporting the students, but creating an overall affirming environment. And that includes teachers as well, who might be gender expansive or trans. So I think that this bill, it's important because we have to take a look at the whole child, and we have to take a look at those that are coming from homes that might be socioeconomically disadvantaged or are Black and brown, or, you know, we have to think about these things. And sometimes, from personal experience, as someone who is gender expansive, did not come from a supportive home, it was so important for me to be able to have those supports in schools, which I didn't have, and which is why I do this work. So that's one of the things that comes to mind in thinking about why it's so important to pass this bill.
Great, thank you. You know, you mentioned that and having supports, and immediately I had a flashback of my 5th grade teacher, Mr. McMullen, who I think really got me. Like, he called me Gilly, so my last name's Gilbo. And on the sports field in 5th grade recess, I could do whatever I wanted. He'd be like, Gilly, you can be any of the boys here. Like, you guys got to watch out for Gilly. He just like supported me. He supported my interest in math and science. I really felt like that was a teacher that got me. And we didn't have any language for it, but he at least, like, he got me, like he was seeing me, no matter how, you know, how it was. And so I think that's important because, you know, I love my parents, but they didn't get me, really. They didn't get me. And you know, again, I know my case is not the worst case scenario, but there's something to be seen by someone. So Rashad, I haven't forgotten about you, my friend. So there are some concerns that maybe, so what concerns might school faculty have in the passage of this bill?
So I think first and foremost, some concerns that some people may have is the fact that they, which they're doing already, which is they're misaddressing students by the wrong gender anyway. You know, but you know, try to cognizantly make sure that they address the student the correct way. But additionally, one, to make sure that they have the support from the administration, because it starts from the top. If the administrators don't agree with it, or if the administrators don't support it or make it a mandate, then it's not going to happen. And I've noticed that even with things that we're doing here in New York with the students, I'll send something out to principals and they're like, oh no, I don't want to get in trouble. I didn't know they would get in trouble for talking about gender, you know? But making sure that administration supports it, making sure that there's access to professional development. And I believe that this is so important. The teachers and school faculty need to make sure that they have their correct training to be able to even address a student who may be struggling or who may be dealing with bullies. There's a way to address those students, and it's not just any way to address any other student. Making sure that we want to make sure that the bill is made law so that we can ensure the safety of our students. So I know that there's many teachers, many educators who are standing behind this. I know NICE at UFT, we stand behind this bill because number one, I think who said it? Angel said it earlier, where they said that the kids spend most time at school. So we want to make sure that they feel safe at school. Some of them are escaping, you know, home and to get away from it all, and then they run into it all there at school as well. But most importantly also is the bathroom discussion, always the bathroom discussion, right? Making sure that they have the resources to offer that gender neutral bathroom for students. And sometimes that means giving up that the adult male bathroom on the floor. That may mean giving it up, but it's because it's most important. We want to make sure that the kids are safe and the kids are comfortable all day, every day. I wrote some notes here, I'm sorry. We want to make sure that we are able to advocate for our LGBTQ students, make sure we advocate for our gender non-conforming students. And the most concerning part right now is the fact that this is just for public schools. So we're not even talking about private school right now. So this law doesn't cover private school. So that's maybe one of the faults or something that's wrong with the bill. But that's all I want to say right now. That's all I can pretty much think of right now.
Great, thank you. I think that is important. You know, the concerns of faculty, the concerns of a lot of adults is, you know, I work for the state. As a diversity and inclusion specialist, I get a lot of inquiries from other state agencies and from state employees across the state where, you know, sometimes they're afraid of making mistakes, so it becomes really awkward. And people don't mean to be awkward, but they're so afraid of being offensive that they end up being offensive. And so you're right in terms of teachers, giving teachers the tools, not just teachers, you know, counselors, everyone, lunch people, you know, people in the cafeteria, the custodians, everyone, bus drivers, everyone, to just give them the education piece, how to handle, what if you make a mistake? Well, how to make it just like any other mistake. It's normal. Don't make a big deal about it. Apologize, move on. There you are. It's actually worse if you make this big to do about it, right? Because it's like, look at this, you know, it's unusual. It's like if I called Rashad, if I called you George, and then I say, oh, sorry, Rashad, you know, it's I call somebody by the wrong name. You remind me of my brother Dave. I call you Dave. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, sorry, you know, or anything else like that. You know, and I tell people, quite honestly, I have misgendered myself, not intentionally, right? But I've done it. Why? Well, because I lived 45, 47 years as female, and sometimes in my head, I'm referring to myself back then, and it happens. I don't do that too often anymore. But, you know, I even call myself by my former name sometimes, especially when I'm doing something that I have done my entire life. And I'll say, and I'll share with you, my birth name was Angie or Angela. And I'll say, Angie, come on. We've been making this mistake for 54 years. Well, I'm talking to Owen, but you know, it started with, you know, who I was then or who I was named then. But that's just the way it is, and we move on. You know, sometimes my mom refers to me when she's talking about the past and history. Sometimes she can't do the gymnastics of the pronouns in the story. And that's okay because, you know, that's how she knew me back then. And we just, you know, as long as she's not referring now, and then we've worked through that. But that's what teachers, staff and faculty need, that ability to be educated just on even the simple things, right? The simple things in life. Quickly to talk about, and this will come up, actually, we'll save it for part two set of questions, because it'll come up. As you said, Rashad, the bathrooms or locker rooms always come up, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that and how we can handle that. And how we do handle that. So thank you, everyone. So we know this is needed, and so many people have given so many examples, and I know we could continue to do this. But the thing about, let me point out again, the thing about this bill, passing it into law, puts teeth on that, right? It puts real meat behind it. It says that if you do not call students by their correct pronouns, you are breaking the law. You are discriminating. And there is recourse for that. It's not a suggestion anymore. It's you must do. And it's the same for the other pieces. So this is really about enforcement, and it's about really forcing. We talk about, you know, board of education. We talk about superintendents and principals and everyone. Teachers, everyone along that line needs to feel safe and supported, because they need to be safe and supportive of our students as well. So there are some common myths. We could probably do a whole panel on myth busting as it relates to students and gender identity. But the content of this bill will cause a moment for putting some shine on truth. And we'll talk a little bit about athletics. We know that is a hot topic in the media, right? And I must admit, I will talk a little bit about gender neutral bathrooms or locker rooms. I am always amazed as a trans male that everyone only wants to talk about trans females and non-binary. They don't seem to care if trans boys lose on the field. They don't seem to, it's really about the attack, and I'll use the word attack because that's really what it is on our youth. The way they present that is one-sided and has so many myths that run about it. We're actually going to talk about, a lot of people already think these kinds of protections are in place, and when they hear about it, they can't believe that students aren't already protected. And that was the same way with the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act for adults. People didn't think it was an issue because they already thought there were protections, and that's not the case. And so we're going to talk just a little bit more, and we're going to come back to this idea that talking about gender identity is somehow not appropriate for school, particularly elementary school. And so this comes to light, especially in Seth giving his, which his hand, by the way, that artwork was amazing and so powerful. Insight for a young person to have and to be able to express. So instead of being in awe, for a teacher to respond the way they did is just horrendous. But why do we need to talk about this in elementary school, and why is it important? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So Micah and I were speaking just before this, and Micah, this topic of gender variant athletics, gender variant students in athletics, particularly trans girls playing sports, school sports, is a topic that you're passionate about. And what would you like to share? Because this bill is going to put into law the fact that students can play sports and use facilities that are consistent with their gender identity without having to prove anything. So what do you think about that?
Well, so first of all, if it's all right, I'd like to go after the myths first, because there are so many myths about trans people in sports and athletics. First of all, there is this idea that the moment you have the slightest bit of testosterone in your body, you're permanently somehow super strong. And that is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard, to be perfectly honest. The current science, which is still being fleshed out, but the current science points out that once you switch hormones, your body very quickly rewrites itself, it changes itself. Obviously, some things like genitalia can't change, but beyond almost everything in your body will realign itself once you switch hormones. And so it takes like somewhere between 1 year and 2 years for a complete switchover. But first of all, people don't even realize that. But second of all, that's not a terribly long period of time. And in younger people, it's even less. And there's precedent that supports allowing younger people specifically to play no matter what, play as their gender, no matter what their hormone situation is. And that's supported by the NCAA, probably the most important athletics body in the United States. There is huge support for allowing people to play based off their gender identity. And in colleges, the standard is 1 year of hormones to switch over the shape of your body appropriately. For the Olympics, it's a little bit more detailed. I believe it is 2 years with 5 nanograms per mole or something like that. I'm not totally sure the exact measurement, but it's but there's a specific standard for the Olympics as well that trans athletes can theoretically pass over, even though has not yet been done. So the idea that one bit of hormone at one point in time is the be all and the end all is really rather silly. And I think that a lot of the opposition to trans people in sports is really about an irrational fear of trans people rather than any actual scientific backing of that theory. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I can attest that just because you take testosterone, it doesn't make you Superman. My wife can attest that too. Sometimes the pickle jar I'm good at, but things that are a little tougher, not so good. And not to make light of that, but I think what is happening is that people are making this a huge target, right? And like you said, the NCAA has had their regulations. They've researched this. They have regulations. Trans individuals play college sports. People have been playing. People have been competing in the Olympics, and the truth is, trans people have not been dominating the medal standings, right? They've not been dominating in all NCAA sports. I know just recently there was a trans woman that won a women's golf tournament, and it was a big to-do. But when we talk about how many tournaments there are for one woman, one person to win, that's not like the proof. There it is. And one of the things that I ask as well is that why are we want to talk about disadvantages or putting people at disadvantage. What about the individuals who pay for private tutoring, private lessons, right? Let's use tennis. You pay for your kid to have private lessons. They get all the best equipment. They get all of this training. They get to play, unended amount of time. Does anyone does anyone say, hey, that's an unfair advantage? We ought to have a rule against, whatever it is, because it really seems to be about winning, right? It's about winning and how to make it so people can't win. And I think our trans youth really are being targeted. Gender variant youth are being targeted about something that is not accurately correct, but it's like, here's where we can put our focus, as in, this is the proof. And as we spoke about, as Alex spoke about earlier, and as others have mentioned, that the mental health aspect of that targeting is it takes a heavy weight. And just like Seth having to sit aside from everyone because of his expression, not being able to play sports just simply because of who you are, that's terrible. I mean, everyone wants to get out and play and have that camaraderie of the team, or even the independent sports, right? That's a ability to express ourselves, and to be denied that when others in our schools are not being denied really is discrimination on a higher level. And so this bill will place it into law that can't happen. So we talked a little bit about actual and perceived protections. I think, let's see, Lindsay, would you like to talk about that at all? Sort of the actual and perceived protections. Have you had any experience when you're advocating, what people's thoughts are on that?
Sure. I feel I had a friend. It's shocking what my friends and family still sometimes say to me, right? But I had a friend recently say to me that my advocacy was so silly because she's been living in Chelsea for 20 years. Like that somehow, so that it was silly that I was even bothering to advocate. And clearly I felt very disturbed and upset by that comment. And I had to go through and say, look, we just, there was conversion therapy until 2019. They were shocking little kids, and they still are in other states. And that, they were getting away with murder for under 12 years up until also like 2019. And like, are you aware of that? Are you aware that these things have been happening? And of course, she was not. And I think she hadn't even been aware of what I went through with the school, or, because I don't talk about it every single day to every single person that I meet. So I do think there's a bit of a bubble of privilege, right? And that anything that's new is scary for people. Just something I want to say is just like what a priority this bill should be is like the rest of the nation is targeting trans youth. I read it's actually the biggest anti-LGBTQI year in history ever. And also violence and murder are on the rise for LGBTQI more than ever. And for New York to stand up and like take a stand, I think is very important to have, New York is supposed to be a progressive state. And when we're looking at 30 other states that they're not using information from doctors and professionals or from trans people, adults, trans children, they're using their fear and their misinformation to kind of guide this policy. So I think it's very important to stand up to that and like send a message that, we protect our trans youth and that we do it in the schools. I believe it's my 14th Amendment. I'd be willing to argue that. So, I'm sorry if I lost point of the question, but, this bill's so important and it's small steps, like baby steps forward, but that it's possible and that it really needs to happen because it is, at the end of the day, it is bullying, it is violence, and it's a very, very high suicide rate. And the only way to address that is by to start educating our youth. And if that is respecting pronouns, that's a good start, right?
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and that was totally on topic. I think that's it. People are not aware because they don't have to deal with it. So they're not aware of what protections are not there. And even I think today, I was an elementary school teacher in the early 2000s, and I know what bullying went on. And I taught at a very small school, but I witnessed a staff member bully a kid because he was quote unquote light in the loafers. And I was like, what did you just say? Like, number one, I'm glad the kid didn't just hear you say that, but I can hear the way you talk to that young boy. And I don't appreciate it. It's not appropriate, and I knew my superintendent / principal would have my back, but that's not okay. And so we got bullying from a teacher, not just the other kids. But where do the other kids get it? Well, if they know your teacher's going to bully you, it's a free for all, right? You can get away with whatever. So I think it is important. And people, who say, well, I don't see it happening. Well, just because you don't see it happening doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I think that's really important. And to realize that there are protections that are needed. And just because you don't understand it, or just you think, well, it must already be covered. We have all these laws. Well, there are particular laws that we don't have. And just like gender passed, it took till 2019 to pass gender and put that into human rights law. And do you know there were legislators in New York State that thought those protections were already in the human rights law? They didn't even realize. So again, that is probably the same type of legislator that are sitting either in the Assembly or Senate and are saying, well, don't we already have this? Isn't that what DASA is? Why do we need this additional information? But it's very important to have that. And so let's talk a bit about this idea why LGBTQIA or AI plus, specifically gender variant topics as a whole, are seen as inappropriate in school settings, and why aren't they? So, Gracia, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'm super passionate about this particular question because I also, in my spare time and for many years, have worked as an organizer, working on different campaigns regarding gender and sexuality, and that includes comprehensive sexual education. And so I think that folks, as McDaniels had mentioned prior, that young people really develop a sense of self at a young age, and then sexual orientation comes later. Who makes your heart thump and who do you want to share your cookies with comes at a later age, but the sense of self comes much earlier. And so what people tend to think, those of us who are not necessarily familiar with those concepts equate it to sex and equate it to something that has to do with that like thumping in your chest and the sharing of cookies, right? And that's really not the case. We know that comprehensive sexuality education is a part of like trans inclusivity, but that's not necessarily the priority at a young age. I think comprehensive sexuality education does play a role, but I think that it comes down to the fact that it can be age appropriate in ways that are really simple and easy. It doesn't have to necessarily be about discussions that we have in high school, right? It can be something as simple as like talking about what it means to have a
Nope, I
diverse
think
family.
you froze. There you go.
Oh, sorry. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you froze just for a moment. So it was right at the best point. No, just joking. So go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just saying like topics don't have to be controversial. It could be as simple as like, what does it mean to have a diverse family, or what does it look like to look a certain way? In fact, I've been trying to write a children's book on, you know, shapes and the way that they can change and shift. And so I think that we can get creative, and it doesn't have to be equated to sex. Like we can make it something that is about sense of self and identity and how you feel inside. It's as simple as that.
Sure. Thank you. Mix Daniels, you wanted to make a comment about this as well?
Yeah, so I first want folks to realize that society is always on a scale. You have the legislative and you have the culture. When the culture is more advanced than the legislative, you're expecting that society will keep each other sensitive and protective, and it also leaves room for harm when we don't have accountability. Now, in New York, the law might be one step forward, but most of the culture is not aware. And as it relates to gender, the average person in New York City even doesn't know what trans is, doesn't know what pronouns are, don't know gender sensitivity, don't know how to address the queer community. They base their information from stereotypes and hateful shows like Maury, and say really awful things that people think that it's curious when it's really, invasive. I won't go into all my experiences of inappropriate questions I've been asked on the job, but I'll just tell you like this. Even when I worked for the New York Public Library for the past few years as an out non-binary worker, I really struggled where nearly 2/3 of my coworkers didn't respect or didn't want to acknowledge my pronouns. And when I went to HR told me, you have to wait 5 years until we come back with gender sensitivity training. I was shocked because we live in New York City. This is the law. And I felt like I was educating people of what they were supposed to do. That was situation one. Situation two, I was working in the DOE and I had principals and assistant principals in the Bronx telling me, we're not going to use your pronouns. We're not going to use your prefix. It's too difficult for me. I remember even working as a teaching artist and leaving LEAP, which is an arts nonprofit. And for a long time, I felt like I had to be silent about my experiences, but I feel like I need to shed light, and it's important for accountability because people are always trying to cover up and trying to silence people for their experiences. And I got to the point I had enough. And I remember this coordinator for the schools was telling me all these rules in ways that I cannot talk about gender and sexuality to middle school children. And I'm like, this is supposed to be a progressive school. The law is supposed to be on my side. How am I supposed to be a representation and keep these kids safe if I can't say X, Y, and Z? And I still proved to the coordinator that I could teach these kids about gender and sexuality and identity in a safe and appropriate way. And mind you, I had to approve everything through the assistant principal and their team to make sure everything that I did. So as a teaching artist, I went to a school in a very rough part of the Bronx and added just being very vulnerable and non-binary and not even coming from a place where I felt completely safer being supported. And yet I did the best that I could. And I remember I just started the class with an amazing example. We all know in the trans community, the genderbread, cartoon, or now it's the space person, the spaceship person, or the unicorn, talking about identity in a spectrum. But I took it in a different way. I took a model of an emoji and I gave every kid one. And I also simply said, we have all these colors to work with. Now let's put gender to the side. Who would like blue? Who would like pink? Who would like yellow? And even doing that in a safe way and allowing folks to pick, or if they wanted to pick without people looking or someone choose for them, they felt safe to explore gender expression. Then we started with the figure. We're like, today we're going to learn about empowering ourselves and who we are. And I want you to envision a superhero and who you are. And you could make it any hair, any color, any place in the world, and added what that safe place looked like. And these kids were able to express themselves in a way and envision themselves. And not only that, find similarities with other kids that they weren't talking to. And then finally, I simply said, you know, some kids go by he for typically boys, she for typically girls. And then there are folks that use they, and I use they. And I also use mix. It's not Mr., not Miss. And the kids just got it. And within a few weeks, starting at this new school, I was like, why is it that the kids were able to figure it out, but the staff were giving me such a hard time? But I was really shocked about how much I was misgendered, how much I wasn't supported, how much I was discriminated, how much I was asked really inappropriate questions, how much I saw staff members that aren't from my community that are miseducating kids and not making them feel safe. And again, we have to remember that people present themselves as they are in the moment. So if someone is exploring, like I had a kid in my class who used the pronoun they and then decided another month to not use, maybe because they didn't come from a supportive family, maybe they were scared about judgment. But for that few months that they did use they felt like someone understood them. And I gave them room to breathe, and I gave them room to be. And I gave them also an opportunity and a representation. Someone looks like them for them to be themselves. And if we don't have physical representation in our schools, where are you supposed to rely your information if it's not poured from a poor source? And that is what's happening in our society. And as much as we're making so much changes in New York, and we still need to remember that private schools, being that they're getting funding from the state and the federal and especially the city, need to be compliant with our schools. I did not feel safe as a kid in an Orthodox Jewish school. And I know there's thousands of kids in our states and in other progressive states that are not having the support and the resources. I'll just name you an example. I remember I was a young child.
Daniels, we're gonna have to move on. I hate to cut you short, but I do want to make sure that we can get to our question and answer period.
I'll just say quickly that I was shamed as a little child for my gender expression by a school that was supposed to protect me. And I didn't know better besides being myself. And that should never happen for anyone, especially in more harmful ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to say anything about this, this idea or kind of a myth that it's inappropriate to talk about, gender identity or any of the LGBTQI issues?
I mean, it was brought up so nicely by the other panelists is that, gender identity and gender expression presents itself as soon as a child exists like in the world and is playing and kind of understanding themselves and this idea that if a child presents themselves other than what is expected, that it has something to do with sex or some sort of flaunting of sexuality or anything like that is related to sexual behavior. It's just an inaccurate understanding of development that's been perpetuated just through a lack of discussion and real dialogue between each other. I think that, the big thing is we get so scared of individuals and little people kind of playing and trying to figure out who they are, because I think we want to be able to control the narrative of our kids, right? We want to be able to protect them and set them in a path for success. And sometimes our idea of what that is can be quite narrow and limiting, and it's mostly out of fear. It's because we don't want our kids nothing to happen to our kids. For a lot of us, we don't want bad things to happen to our kids, so we get scared. And so it's important that our schools actually build a culture that we can model to parents what it means to be safe, what it means to give kids a space for creativity, that it's actually okay for a child to play in all sorts of ways and present themselves in ways that they feel comfortable and want to share with others. Schools have to be able to model some of that, because parents are sometimes very limited to their little bubble of being a parent in their home. So there's an opportunity there for us really to collaborate and work together as a community to have safe spaces for children. I think, you know, I know as a queer parent, I have a deaf child, a queer deaf child. I could not have raised my child without the deaf community helping me raise them, to help me, show me what it meant to help my child be a deaf person and queer in the space. So we need each other to be supportive of our growth and development.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, and the truth is, we talk about gender all the time. As soon as, it's amazing to me how as soon as someone announces they're pregnant, what is the first thing everyone wants to know? Oh, do you know the gender yet? You know, we're actually expecting another granddaughter in 1 week, a grandchild in 1 week. And the first thing people said was, you know, when I said, oh, we're expecting a grandchild, they say, well, do you know what they're having? And my response was, yes, a human. They're having a human. And they're like, oh, sorry. I go, yeah, I am sorry, because I kind of wanted a mini goat, but apparently we're getting another baby human. And I think it really is amazing to me how important, because otherwise, how will we know what color clothes to buy and what toys to buy, you know, all of that. So we really do talk about gender, and we talk about it with young children. Just how we control that narrative, I think, really also is out of fear as well. Anyone else want to talk about that before we move on to our last set of questions?
Yes, Owen. I just think
Sure.
that if we have people that start looking, I think a lot of people are still thinking of gender as sex. And they're two totally different things. And I'm glad that we progressed to the point where, you know, some people are knowing the difference. But if people can put sex to the side and just focus on the gender, I think we would be in a better place. And I think Ms. Daniels said it earlier, you know, the children are not the problem. It's the adults that are the problem, because they're used to the old ways. You know, a lot of adults have not progressed to where we are today. So.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Just for any of you out there, including panelists, but anyone in the audience, a great book is called It Feels Good to Be You. It's a book about gender identity. It's a wonderful, brilliantly illustrated book by Teresa Thorne. I am no way related to her, nor plugging this for any other reason than it's beautifully illustrated. It's so well done. It explains what transgender, cisgender, non-binary means. It's full of diversity. And I've known many young children to read it and just go, oh. And I've had a couple people tell me that their stuffed animal is non-binary. This is what it means. And they move on. And I had another little boy who said to me, you know, was answering a question that had nothing to do with gender identity. But in his little rant, he said, oh, and some people are boys and some people are girls and some people are neither and some people are both. And then he went on to talk about red balloons. But he had read this book, and this was the information he had. And it was just part of life. So I think that's important. So we're here to convince people that we want to pass this bill. We need to pass this legislation, and it's important. So what can members of the audience do to support the passage of this anti-discrimination requirements bill in the schools bill? And so what do we think? And I'm just going to go around the panel and ask you what you think about that. And then we're going to open it up for audience questions, answers, and questions. So let's start with Micah. Micah, what is your recommendation? What can people do what can we do today? And what can our audience do to help people understand the importance of passing this bill?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, if we really want to get this bill passed, it's important to call our legislators, talk to them, email them, communicate to your assembly person or your senator to help pass this legislation. And I think it's also important to talk to your neighbors, the people you know, and try to get them on board too. I know that a lot of people aren't educated on this, and I know that it can be scary to go out there and just talk about this. But I think that there's also power, like try to slip it in a conversation with someone else, try to keep the pressure up.
Okay,
Anyway.
great. Thank you, Micah. Lindsay, what do you think?
I
What
know
advice?
it would be great if you sign a petition that we've sent out to you. We have an email with some action items in there, and that email is very easy to sign the petition. If you put your address in, it will automatically send a letter to your representative. And also, I think it would be great phone calls. It's really about getting the assembly members and the senators to sign on to the bill. And right now we're getting organizations to sign on to the bill and really giving it that pressure that it is important and that it is a priority. And that if you look at everything else that's going on right now, how could it not be a priority, especially for someone like Seth or my family. And so it's very important to, take a stand and to like learn a new way. And it's not impossible because they've seen it done in schools where they're like our new school's so great. So it can be done, and it just takes some training. And it's really that simple. It just takes some training and some education. And we have agenda to back it. And so they go together, right? So that we're able to really, it's not just some writing on the wall, it's protocol, and it's a form of respect, and it's what we're asking for. So again, it's sign the petitions, talk to your representatives, and really put some pressure on this bill. Sign on if you're a senator or assembly member. And thank you for supporting the bill. Thank you for being here.
Excellent, thank you. Rashad, go ahead. We just got a few minutes. I do want to open it up for questions.
Okay, I think that most importantly, as everyone has already said, talk to your legislatures. You voted them in for a reason. You should be able to approach them about this. But most importantly, I think that we should really get our students involved in, the what it means to, to petition and to lobby. Have our students, high school students, write letters to the politicians to tell them how important it is and how they felt. True stories, your own personal stories tell a lot, and it can really make a big difference.
Thank you, Alex. Any last minute words?
I would just say, whether you have children or not, regardless, we all share space all together. So really becoming educated and really being able to speak up. We pay taxes. And so it's really on all of us to make a safe space for each other, right? Like we depend on one another to live safely and be productive. So, it's not just it's not a parent issue or a teacher issue, it's a community issue. So to please get educated, start these conversations up, whether you're directly impacted or not, it doesn't matter. It's that you share space with somebody, and this could be an opportunity for you to really open the door for others to have a healthier life.
Thank you. McDaniels, really quickly, and then we'll go to Gracia.
So again, we need to remember that our schools, city, and state are failing our children. Only 60% of our kids are graduating. In New York City, for example, there's already homelessness and malnutrition. And added, if you're being discriminated for who you are, and if you care about the welfare, about future leaders in this country, it needs to include all, as discrimination is not tolerated in our schools in New York. And we are one of the most progressive states, but we are one of the most low scoring states as it results to national average in other states, and especially other countries. And it's really upsetting, and it starts at home with affirming settings. Thank you.
And Gracia.
Quickly, what I would say, and this goes out to educators and administrators who I work closely with in Illinois schools, is that implementation is going to be a challenge once this bill is passed. And just because it's a mandate doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a seamless process. So what I would say is, in support of this bill, if you're an educator or an administrator, do some research. I'd be happy to share the non-regulatory guidance that the Illinois State Board of Education provides on how to support trans and gender expansive students. You as a teacher and an administrator can start implementing this in your classroom with the help of others. And I think that that's something that we should be thinking about, is how to get boots on the ground as this process keeps going. So.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I do want to point out to our audience that you should have been seeing you should be seeing in the chat box that there are ways and connections, site links from equalitynewyork.org on how to contact your legislator and other ideas for which you can use to talk to others, but particularly to reach out to your legislators at this point. We do have some time for questions and answers, a question and answer period. And so this question is for Lindsay. Lindsay, Andy is curious to know how Seth's classmates are reacting to Seth's self-affirmation.
So Seth goes by he, him, his. And at that point, and that's another reason why it's why it's important to respect pronouns, because not every trans person is out publicly, and that's important to protect their safety, because when they're fitting in, they're much more safe. It doesn't mean they're not unique. Everyone is unique, actually. And I understand that people have hatred for people's differences, but putting that all aside, we protect Seth with a bit of a bubble because Seth is a boy. I understand that. I know some people still need to understand that. That does not mean Seth has had surgery. That does not mean that Seth has started hormones. It doesn't even necessarily that he ever will. I mean, I know Seth, he probably would like to, but that's not the topic of discussion, right? But a lot of people have misunderstanding of what it means to be transgender. It's occurring in the brain. There's other places where gender occurs in the body, and it is lining up scientifically with what Seth is saying. He's a boy. Science is showing his brain is going to look like the boy brain, right? And so we just refer to Seth as he, him, his, my son. I sign papers at school that are gender documents. That gets the entire school on board, and they know that if they were to mess it up, I'm a different kind of parent too. I'm an advocate. I know people at Lambda Legal. Like, I'm not someone who's going to sit back and just take whatever they give me, but not every child is going to have a parent that has that kind of time and privilege. Nor has it been especially fun for me to take up so much time to be fighting the system all the time, so that his classmates, Steph shares that maybe with a few people, and that's usually kids at Ackerman Gender Family Project that are more gender variant or trans kids or non-binary, fluid. And we have some friends there, and thank goodness, because it's really given Seth an understanding that he's not alone. But as far as at school, Seth goes by he, him, his. Teachers are respecting the pronouns. That's why we left the last school. The counselor is great, and everyone's on board at this school, but that's taken a lot of time to research what school to get into, to deal with the Department of Education. That was not an easy process and took over, a year. So thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I do want to point out that also in our chat book, Grecia provided some resources. I know earlier McDaniels did as well in terms of supportive schools. And I know we have a couple of other questions that talk about any thoughts about how to be more supportive for your children and in dealing with schools. And so there are resources there. Any other panelists tonight, if you'd like to put any of your resources or suggestions in the chat box, please go ahead and do so. We have a question from Rachel, who says, I know this is dealing primarily with schools. I work with a foster care agency in New York City. Would anyone be able to speak on the state of the safety of trans and non-binary youth in the New York foster care system? So I do know that currently that the Office of Children and Family Services is working well, there are individuals there, but I know there is legislative bills that are either being written or have just been written, not by that agency, but by some senators and assembly people to take this further and address the safety and well-being of trans or gender variant youth in the foster care system, and particularly as it comes to being those youth being able to use, again, just like in the schools, to have their names and pronouns recognized and used safely for them to receive the appropriate medical and behavioral health care and that type of thing. So there is work being done there. And I do know the Office of Children and Family Services are also working to try to find more ways to educate individuals, parents, and other providers in the foster care system. And so, McDaniels, did you want to say something about that?
Now, I always try to appreciate any progress that we are making as agencies, as a culture, as a city. And I don't want to take away from the positivity of tonight, but it is from my experience, having also worked in the shelter system, horrendous. 1 in 10 New York City public youth aren't being fed. 1 in 8 aren't being housed. 40% of our youth across the country are LGBT and homeless. In New York City alone, there are tens of thousands overpopulated, mostly trans identified of all ages, folks that are in our shelters. And the shelters are also a resource of trying to reconnect folks with education so that they could get employment. And there is not the competency that we see and the safety that we see, especially for non-binary and gender non-conforming folks, when so many of our shelters are segregated. I could go on, but the foster care system for all people, especially for more folks that are vulnerable, like the TGNCI community, needs drastic reform in order to be inclusive, in order to care. And finally, there is the reality, as much as there was a law recently passed to allow trans parents to be able to adopt in New York, but still the culture, not only in New York, but elsewhere, so many of these agencies that are religious based and are still holding on to bigoted values that are not allowing loving, affirming, welcoming, able trans people to take in trans children or even cis allies, creates a problem for these trans kids to be able to find a proper home and to be loved and to be wanted. And we need to do that work not only, as Grisha said, legislatively, but culturally, as the information needs to be sensible, top down. So we could talk more about this on the side, but
Great.
a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that. That's important. And you know, we have a lot of work to do. We know that within our community. And so we could probably spend all night talking about the different areas where we need to continually do. But we all can work on the cultural piece within our own circles of influence and such. So we have 2 more questions. One question is, does or can this bill be interpreted in such a way that it helps improve the working experience of trans non-binary teachers and school staff? So we do have agenda that is part of the protections, but Rashad, would you like to tackle that question a little bit and talk just a little bit about protections or ways in which we can improve the working experience of trans non-binary teachers and school staff?
So I can only speak from New York City. New York City, we have the Department of Education has an agency called the Office of Equal Opportunity. And if you feel that you're being discriminated against for your sex, your gender, expression, race, religion, whatever, you contact the Office of Equal Opportunity and you can file a complaint with them and they will investigate. And if it's founded, whoever the complaint is against will be disciplined by their supervisor. As well as, you know, I'm here with the I'm here with the U of T Pride Committee, and I have a working relationship with the new Jared Fox, who is Eric Vaughn. He is amazing at just getting information out there and also supporting not only students but teachers as well. So I will put my email in the chat, and if anybody has any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me.
Great, thank you so much. And I think part of UFT, we've been using that acronym, that's the United Federation of Teachers. And that's okay, I was part of the AFT. So, but NYSUT, which is the New York State Union. United Teachers, thank you. I always get the U wrong. United Teachers, I think do have some resources as well. But I do know personally, when I was talking to Randy Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, I pointed out to Randy that there are many ways in which the union can strengthen their own practices when it comes to trans and non-binary teachers, union siblings, so on and so forth. So hopefully those are some resources, though this bill in particular, passing this bill, is really aimed at protection and providing for our gender variant youth. And then one last question, and we've got about a minute or two. So my child is gender fluid. They have been virtual this year, but we'll be back in the building next year for the first time since coming out. And it will be the first time school sports are an option for them. I'm not sure what to expect. Grateful for any thoughts. So there have been a few resources in the chat box, but anyone here on the panel like to say something? Micah.
Yeah, okay, so my thoughts on this matter, I've researched this a lot, but my thoughts on the matter are that generally trans feminine people are far more likely to be attacked for participating in sports than trans masculine people are. And also, generally speaking, people really don't care when trans feminine people compete at all unless they win. So I think that if your child is just on a team and they don't go to a state level championship, no one will care. But looking at like what happened in Connecticut, looking at what has happened elsewhere in the US, I do think that if a trans feminine person wins on a state level or higher, it will probably be big news in some areas that are not very friendly to trans people. And I think that's one of the reasons why there are so few trans people in sports and athletics.
Hi, Owen.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you for that. And we need to wrap it up. So I'm sure this is why Terry has come back on the line. It is that time. We've spent an hour and a half already. Thank you everyone for participating. Before I turn it back over to Terry, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience and the panelists for joining us this evening. I'm also encouraging all of you to download the link for the bill, which has been posted in the chat box several times. You can go to www.newyorksenate.gov, legislation, bills, 2021, S369. That should be in the chat box. Better yet, visit the Equality New York website. Excuse me. That's equalityny.org. I encourage you to become a member of Equality New York. I also encourage you to go on that website. There's more information about contacting your legislators and more information about the bill itself. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Terry.
Okay. Well, on behalf of Equality New York and from myself and the panel committee to create this event, I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panelists. This was a really good night. I'm really thankful for you giving your time and giving us your really insightful responses and sharing a little bit of your lives with us. So hopefully it helps us push this bill further ahead and to make this law and find us more support and gain passage. Well, I have to thank you, everybody, for a good night, and thank you for everybody attended. And I hope you hear some good feedback. So have a good night, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Ciao.
Night.